everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We have folks signed in from within our ISKL community, teachers, staff, and parents, and friends from Malaysia and across the world. I can see friends from New Delhi, we have friends from Saigon. Thank you for joining us today. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. Salamat datang kay ISKL. I am Joel Llaban, our school-wide DEIJ lead at iScale, and I'm your host and moderator for today. And thank you also for those who will be listening to the recording of this conversation this afternoon. And here's a little bit of framing around what VOX ISKL is. It is a virtual platform for learning that supports our continuous growth as a school community and our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. This is our fourth VOX ISKL session. Our previous sessions include Living by Our Values by Dr. Simran Singh. It was hosted previously by Dr. Praxia Apostle. The Art of Courageous Conversations with Joellen Killen. Identity-Centered Learning with Daniel Wickner. And today it will be with our dear friend Jessica Wei Huang. They can all be accessed from iScale's YouTube and Spotify accounts. This year, at iScale, educators and leaders continue to harness our collective capacity to learn and reflect on the principles and practices of DEIJ. We have set up intentional work in our K-12 committees to courageously challenge ourselves, to research, to learn, to take actions on DEIJ. We're committed to DEIJ because we believe that it is our responsibility. It's the responsibility of schools to protect our children and adults against exclusion, discrimination, and injustice. DEIJ is a key element now that undergirds three of our ISKL strategic priorities. One on social emotional learning, on community and culture, and operational excellence. We will become more diverse when our school is safe, caring, equitable, and inclusive. When we have these conditions at our schools, we can all participate, lead, thrive, learn, and succeed without leaving any parts of ourselves. It is now time to introduce today's panel. We are so honored to be joined by our student panelists. I'm going to get started with Mizuki Saito, a grade 11 international baccalaureate student at ISKL. She is a member of the DEIJ Committee on Student Leadership team in the high school and is passionate about shifting the perception of DEIJ and making ISKL an even better place to be for everyone. Thank you, Mizuki, for joining us today. The second one is Kai Hafiz, is a grade 10 student who is currently undertaking the Praxis 2030 program at iScale. She's a member of the DEIJ committee in the student leadership team in the high school and is passionate about creating positive change by fostering a safe and open-minded culture at iScale. Thank you, Kai, for being with us today. Now off to our educator panelists. Both of them are our school librarians. Catherine Bay is the elementary teacher librarian at ISKL and is passionate about teaching research strategies for elementary students and providing books that represent our student body. She's constantly on the lookout for fun and engaging books of our elementary readers and seeks to guide our students as they navigate through the information they come across. Kath holds a Master of Education in Teacher Librarianship, a graduate diploma in educational studies on learning difficulties, and a Bachelor of Education in primary. This is her fourth year at iScale and fifth international school after Qatar, Taiwan, South Korea, and Australia. Lisa Jensen Hengsler is in her seventh year teaching IB Theory of Knowledge and English Language and Literature at iScale. Lisa has over 20 years of experience teaching students of all ages, from early childhood to adult learners in Canada, Cyprus, Kuwait, El Salvador, and Brazil. Next year, she will be our middle school, high school librarian at iScale. Lisa has a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Drama, Bachelor of Education in Drama and Social Studies, and Bachelor of Education in International Education. She also has an additional qualification in teacher librarianship from Queen's University. At this point, I would like to introduce our guest expert, my friend and learning partner. She's a leadership mentor and a warm demander. Jessica Huang, who is our guest speaker today, introduced me to Adrienne Marie Brown. Adrienne Marie Brown wrote in her book, "We Will Not Cancel Us." She said, "In this sanctuary, We feel our victory where winning means a mass and collective healing, where winning isn't measured by anyone else's loss, but by breaking cycles of abuse, harm, assault, and systemic oppression, where winning is measured not just by the absence of patterns of harm, distrust, and isolation, but the presence of healing and healthy interdependence. I would like us to sit with that for a bit, as that powerful words resonate with me, and I hope it resonates with you too. Today's VOX ISKL centers on growing a school community for identity, agency, and healing. Our guest speaker, Jessica Wei Huang, will expand on Daniel Wickner's concepts of identity-centered learning and will take us through a framework designed to tackle the challenges of developing a truly equitable and inclusive culture. She's an educator and a leader with 20 plus years of experience as a classroom teacher, a school administrator, a leadership coach, and facilitator. She has a wide range of knowledge on how to build an equitable school community. Through her on the ground work in schools and her support and coaching of educator teams, she creates healing centered, student focused spaces where students of all backgrounds can thrive. Jessica has a Bachelor's of Foreign Service from Georgetown University and a Master's of Education from Stanford University. Her experience in both the public school system in the US and international schools equipped her to lead in a wide variety of cultural contexts. Jessica is currently serving as Vice Principal at the United World College of Southeast Asia in Singapore. My friend, thank you for being with us today, for leading our collective learning, and on to you.
Thank you, Joel, for that amazingly beautiful introduction. It is a true honor to be with you all here today. So excited to be in conversation with the students and teachers and all of you audience members today. I truly believe that this work is really about the community that we build and the conversations that we have. So let's get to it. The title for today is Growing a Community for Identity, Agency, and Healing. And a lot of this content it's an introductory content based off of some training that we could spend hours talking about. So just know that today is an introduction of a framework that I've used and practiced in many different cultural contexts. And so I hope that it's useful for you today to think about agency and healing. So before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about my why. And I think it's really important in DEI work to really access our whys. I'm first and foremost an educator. I started teaching 7th grade in San Francisco, where I lived most of my adult life, but I was born in Arizona. I really believe that education has the possibility of truly changing people's lives because it did change my family's lives. Not only because of the content that we teach as teachers, but because we have the possibility of developing people's sense of self through our relationships. So teachers have the possibility of being identity facilitators. And I know that's a lot of what Daniel talked about last time. And I will kind of move that concept of identity onto who we can develop as people, as educators, and as students in our schools to develop a sense of agency. And for me, agency means that we have a sense of control of our futures and our destinies. So there's many layers of my identities that I could talk about, but I want to talk about my identity as a mother and as a daughter. I have 2 children, and you can see them on the right side of the screen. And on the left side, they're pictured here with their cousins and their only surviving grandparent, my maternal grandmother, born in China. She met my grandfather in Hong Kong. They traveled to Vietnam, where my father was born. And she still lives on today in Tucson, Arizona, where most of my paternal side of the family lives after having to leave Vietnam after the war. As many of you may have discussed during some of the conversations you've had in your schools, our identities grow and change, and our lives are maps of our identity journeys. And today, as you listen, I want you to think about who you are now, who you might have been in the past and who you want to be in the future, as a parent, as a student, as a young person, as an adult, as an educator. Who inspires you to be your best, and what is the lineage that you're continuing? So what we're up to today, and I've talked with Joel a little bit about what your community has worked on and who you are as a school. And so we're going to concentrate on three things: developing the interpersonal skills to maintain an organization's vision towards DEIJ goals, understanding the warm demander framework for calling others in to be the best versions of ourselves, and then committing to the ongoing work of sharpening our equity lens to maintain our personal and moral authority to lead and support DEIJ goals in our school community. So I like to think of this work as systems, but as people, interpersonally, we uphold the systems that we navigated in our institutions. Some reflection questions for you to sit with for a moment. When we think about our interpersonal relationships, we'd like to think that they're all going well. But many times when we think of our strongest relationships, we tend to know that we have to navigate through tension. A lot of that tension and the way in which we deal with tension and conflict come from our backgrounds, our cultures, and the ways in which we experienced our families dealing with conflict. So think about these questions. How is conflict dealt with in your family? How does it affect you? How does conflict affect you today in your relationships and at work? And how do you compensate for your tension around conflict so that no one knows? And what do you most need or want when a conflict occurs? You can think about conflict in your personal life or conflict at work. So just sit with those questions for a minute. So in the first part of today, I'd like to talk about identity. And when we think about a sense of self, for many of us, especially from cultures where we may be part of the dominant culture or the marginalized culture, we want to talk about possibilities of identity erasure and identity empowerment. So our identities are journeys. How our identities change are based on our time, our space, our context, and the events in which we experience. We also have different perspectives, right? So the way that we see ourselves may be different than the way that we're perceived in our environments. So the idea of double consciousness was coined by W.E.B. Du Bois in the books that he writes about. But it really talks about this idea that many of us have two consciousness. And he says that when one accepts or buys into the negative messages that are propagated about who we are and who we can and cannot become, we internalize negative or sometimes positive stereotypes like the model minority myth as one of our consciousness. And so how do we hold who we really truly are while still understanding how we're being perceived in our environments? So one example might be if I am a woman of color vice principal, I may think about how I'm being perceived when I walk into a room while still then authentically having to search for who I truly am. And that is a lot of emotional labor for many people to navigate, thinking about how we want to be perceived, but actually then who we truly are. So then bringing it back to students, we might put on masks, or we might internalize the masks that are assigned by the adults in our environments. So we might put on masks, or we might be assigned these masks, right? From a student perspective, we might think that students are mean, that they're perfectionists, that they're obsessed with grades, or that they don't care about their grades. They might seem spoiled or disinterested. They might seem apathetic or entitled. Now, in many of our times of stress and tension, we may all have these thoughts, right? Either of ourselves or other folks in our community. The idea about setting an environment where we can all become our best identities is asking the question, how do we nurture the soil so that young people can grow into the best versions of themselves? Now, within the context of a school community, we may also ask, how do we nurture the soil so that adults and educators can grow into the best versions of ourselves? So if we think back to the purpose of school, this is actually a picture of an international school in Asia. I won't say which one, in the early 1900s. And you'll see straight rows, teachers up front, actually an American flag at the top. And to be honest, our ideas of education have not changed much in the last 100 years. We see education as economic competition and success. It feeds into the factory model of schooling, where we are pushing out productive citizens for capitalism. And sometimes we think about teaching as teaching what's already been discovered, right? That there is a knowledge base that we need to tell students. And in some ways, a lot of research shows that the best predictor of a student's success is our social structure and status. Now, how do we build the container to nurture DEIJ in schools? We look at schools as ways to build student character and to produce action for social and community change in the world. And if we look at a lot of our mission statements, right, for many schools, not just international schools, it talks about student character building and making positive change. So how do we create schools that actually help students develop the agency in order to do that? And so that educators see themselves as facilitators of building agency. And this is a framework that we developed as educators at the June Jordan High School in San Francisco. It is not the answer, but it is some of the frameworks that we believe were important. We need to have safe classroom communities. Classroom communities need to be safe for all students, no matter their identities. Students should be seen as intellectuals, bringing in their own experience and brilliance as part of the content and curriculum, and voices need to be valued. Teachers should be seen as coaches, right? And not just knowledge givers. We need to know where our students are and who they are, not who we want them to be or who we imagine them to be. We need to start where they are. And we need to provide a curriculum that helps students understand the real world and the historical context to systems of oppression. Importantly, we need to maintain a sense of joy and well-being. And for me, the warm demander sits at the top. It means that we develop our students as human beings and humans first, and ourselves in the meantime as well. And so the warm demander is about holding high expectations while giving a lot of support to get there. So becoming a warm demander. Warm demanders, as Lisa Delpit said, she says that warm demanders are teachers who expect a great deal of their students, convince them of their own brilliance, and help them to reach their potential in a disciplined and structured environment. And this matrix comes out of the original research around effective teaching from Kleinfeld, 1972. She did study with the indigenous First Nations peoples in Alaska, and just noticed, what does it look like when students are learning from people that they trust, who are educators from their community, right? My spouse likes to talk about the warm demander as like your grandmother. She has high expectations for you, but she is not going to let you get away with stuff, right? All right, so if you look at the matrix and you have the demandingness and the warmth, sophisticates have low expectations and low relationships. Traditionalists might have high expectations, but low connection with students, and they might provide low support. Sentimentalists have low expectations for students, but they might have really strong relationships. And warm demanders is a cocktail mix of demandingness and warmth. Warm demanders have high expectations and high relationships with the young people. They explicitly focus on relationships. They view their identity and others as central to support in education or leadership. And while they hold high standards, they offer and provide both emotional and technical support. And I think that's key, right? When we think about scaffolding for young people or adults, we need to provide technical support, but we also need to be providing the emotional support to support that high standard. So if we're thinking about students, we could vacillate between, right, the two structures. A traditionalist might over rely on policies, grades, institution, or positional power. And we might put these masks on kids, right? We might label them as troublemakers. We might label them as resistant. We might label them as bad. On the other end, the sentimentalist might label students as lazy, low-skilled, or traumatized, and we might provide sympathy and care without a balance of high expectations, and it may lead to low expectations for student performance. And so on any given day, as educators or as parents, I'm a parent as well, I might move between the traditionalist and the sentimentalist. And this is helpful for me to think about, where can I be in the middle? Now, when we think about positionality, we may use a warm demander conversation between an adult and a child. And we have to think about the power that we hold because of our positionality and our age, and that adults always have more authority than children because of the way our society is structured. That is just a given, and it's not something that we can deny that we have. But then there's this idea of authority, right? And authority is different than power. Authority is the influence that is predicated based on your legitimacy and your relationship with one person, right? So you can definitely have power and not authority, right? Power is necessary for authority, but it is possible to have power without authority. In other words, power is necessary, but not sufficient for you to have authority with somebody else. And that might be an adult with a child, but it might be a relationship between two adults in a school. When we have an effective warm demander relationship with someone else, it gives us the possibility to inspire the growth in another person based on the relationship. And so really the goal is to provide that nurturing relationship and the high expectations. So moving on to the adult-adult relationship. And this is actually a quote from Shane Safir's book, Street Data, page 201. Warm demanders don't expect their colleagues to change overnight, but they do expect them to take risks, look in the mirror, and build anti-racist, anti-bias muscle. When it comes to microaggressions and other oppressive behaviors, they hold colleagues accountable to do no harm and to take full, unequivocal responsibility for the harm that they may inadvertently cause. So when we think about our relationships with adults, and as a person with positional leadership, right, I may then look at the technical side of things. I may use command and control leadership. I may be over-focused on technical policies and procedures. And that comes from the anesthesia of power. The anesthesia of power is the title of an essay written by Mab Segrest. And Mab Segrest studied the effects of privilege in people in the United States, right? And what she's saying is that if you already have power, you can be anesthetized by that feeling and forget what it's like to not have power. And so when we overly rely on our positionality in order to get somebody else to change, and we forget about the relationship and the emotion, then we are relying, right, on our power in order to get something done. On the other side, we could be a little bit too enabling in our leadership. We could avoid hard conversations, and we can actually give in to fragility. And Paulo Freire calls that false generosity. It means that we do not believe that the other person can change. We may think that, that they're good enough, and that at least their students aren't doing blank in the classroom, but we're not helping people to move forward within their understanding of equity work. So now I'll go through what the framework looks like in 3 easy steps. And really quickly, these are some scenarios that you can use the warm demander framework in. And From an adult to child, I think in a school environment, when we hear student to student put downs, particularly those that use slurs or terms for marginalized groups, in classrooms, I hear a lot of adults say, well, I know they shouldn't be saying that, but I don't know what to say and I don't want to call them out. And we can use these conversations when a student has made a mistake in behavior, the process of making amends and being able to restore the harm moving forward and building that shame resilience. But similar with adults, right? If it's an adult to adult, then when an adult has harmed another adult or student in school, they also need the support to understand their mistake and reframe a path moving forward. I know there also might be some parents in the room, in the Zoom room. As a parent, I have also used this framework with my own kids. But now that my kids know the framework, they also use it on me. So for the students here in the DEIJ Student Committee, you can use this framework in order to speak truth to power as well. All right, so it's 3 easy steps, but it takes practice. So the first step that I think about is, how do I show strength within a situation? I think about my vision, but I then think about the vision and mission of the school or the institution. I think about any frameworks or equity values, and I try to take myself out of it, right? Depersonalize the situation. We are a representation of the values of our institution. Stay calm and communicate clearly, using humor, intensity, or personal story to set the stage. And then if it's adult to adult, don't capitulate to deficit language or white fragility, right? Stay strong in the face of folks' fear and discomfort, which will come up. So strong is calm, respectful, intense, and funny. Calm is not hurt, manipulated, anxious, and mad. And so when we take things personally, we can give actually off the feeling of being weak within that conversation. The second stage is listen and affirm. And even when we're trying to call somebody in, we have to give people a chance to say how they felt about the situation. And so for me, listening and affirming does not necessarily mean that you completely agree with the other person, but you affirm that their emotions and their experience is valid. This is the time where you then listen to yourself and your body. You listen to the other person, not just with your ears, but you uncover what's underneath. And that character, the Chinese character for Ting, reminds us that listening is a complete and full body experience. And we then affirm the person's humanity and capacity to grow. A really simple strategy that I use in the listen and affirming portion of the conversation is really using their words to repeat back to them what I heard them say. We take the time to do this in order to validate that the other person is a part of the conversation and has broadened their experience. If we skip this part, the third part will remain unheard. So oftentimes we want to get to the third part of the conversation right at the beginning. And the third part of the conversation is important, but there's a couple parts that I practice continuously. If an incident has occurred, it could be a microaggression, it could be a mistake that someone has made, help the person see the bigger picture related to systemic racism or other systemic oppression at play. And that way you're not naming and shaming, but we're reminding people that we're all part, right, of the same institutions and ideology. And it's really up to us as a collective in order to help each other grow. Flipping the script. Flipping the script means that we like to play out negative conversations in ways that are very predictable. Flip the script and help the other person share power and agency in the conversation, right? Ask them what they think they could do to repair the harm. Ask them what they would like to do next and what support they need. And then ask, really connecting back to the first part around what type of educator do you want to be? What type of young person do you want to be? How do you see yourself in the future? And how can I help you mend what has happened? So I know those were 3 steps and 3 very nuanced situations. So a couple of things that I want to talk about. Sometimes in our schools, we have an aversion to conflict. And that brings out some of the things that sometimes hold us back in having hard conversations. The idea that there is a right to comfort, right? The belief that those with power have a right to emotional and psychological comfort more than we do, or more than marginalized folks, or more than students. Scapegoating those who cause discomfort, for instance, BIPOC individuals who call attention to institutional oppression. And then sometimes there is fear of open conflict, people in power avoiding conflict or disagreement. And it doesn't necessarily need to be people in power leaders. It can be, anyone in the institution. When someone raises an issue that makes it uncomfortable, the response is to blame the person who speaks up. They did it wrong. They did it too angry. They had the wrong tone. And sometimes politeness is used to deny people the space to feel and be themselves. And the idea that raising difficult issues is equated with being impolite, rude, or not in adherence with professionalism. So lastly, I did talk a little bit about speaking truth to power. You can use this framework also to speak truth to power, right? We can use power and authority in ways that help us have the right conversations. And it's really important to understand where the power lies in the conversation. If you're somebody with more power and somebody is trying to speak their truth to you, it's really important to then really practice the listen and inform portion, right? Thinking about how we can use our power responsibly. So lastly, these are some of the things that I try to remember myself. How do we believe in the impossible? Sometimes we don't have these conversations because we don't know where they're going to go to, and that's okay. How do we build trust with the people in our community so that when we know we need to have a warm demand or conversation, they are easier? How can we build the self-discipline to give ourselves the time to address hard issues? And then how do we embrace failure? How do we say, oh, I tried that conversation. Actually, it didn't work out this time. Who do I reflect with so I can try it again? All right. And so I will end today with, again, bringing it back to identity, agency, and healing. Through warm demander conversations, we can build our own agency to change others that are needed in our institutions and systems. When someone makes a mistake, a microaggression, an unconscious bias comes up, we can call attention to it because we have the tools. We can remain calm. We can activate our moral compass. We can use our mission and values as a guide in order to build agency in others, to be able to craft their own path forward and to make amends. And that's the way we can continue to heal.
Wow, Jessica, thank you so much for providing us with this powerful input today. What really resonates with me is that whole idea when you started out with the why of education, it talks about developing that sense of self. And at the same time, you provided us a framework that has the mindsets and dispositions for us to become warm demanders so that it can support us as we nurture the soil that can support us in becoming more of the best versions of ourselves. And thank you for that. We deeply appreciate your leadership in our conversation today. Let's get started with anyone to just share with us what resonates with you from Jessica's presentation this afternoon. What does a climate of culture of identity development, agency, and healing have to do with adults and students at school? So anyone, you're more than welcome to get started. Kath, go for it.
Hi, everybody. Just a couple of things that sort of popped into my head, especially when Jessica mentioned about building trust, that being able to sort of, I'm a strong believer in educating a whole child. So when you have that strong relationship and being that warm demander, like I love that term, but just being able to have that high standards and high expectations while you're supporting to allow the kids or the students that we have in our care to reach their maximum potential. I thought that was quite strong for me, really resonated with me. So yeah.
Yes, I'll jump in. I love the grandmother metaphor. I think that suits it quite nicely. I also, what really resonated with me was the challenging of niceness, right? And that really made me think, it's about being critical thinkers. It's about depersonalizing. It's about empathy, but as Brene Brown says, clear as kind, right? And so getting past that, trying to be nice all the time, or trying to be polite, or falling into some of those kinds of traps that we have. I think that that's pretty important.
Thanks, Kath and Lisa. Yeah, for Mizuki and Kai, this is really specific to our high school panelists. What about the content of the presentation resonated with you when it comes to relationships, especially with people in authority in your lives at school, at home, and in the communities? What might be some of your thoughts around that?
Yeah, something that resonated with me a lot is that teachers should be seen as coaches. And I really like that because in ISKL, we're taught that like supervisors and teachers are there to support you when we need the help. But for the most part, we should initiate the action ourselves. This can be seen in my curriculum, the IB, like during CAS projects. Although we do have a supervisor, we decide what we do, and we decide like how to do it and when to do it. And I think this also helps us become better leaders because we get used to the idea of like initiating something and leading things, even if it's just a small group.
I was going to say something a bit more similar to like what Miss Jensen actually, Miss Lisa, sorry, brought up. Like, there's that fear of like open conflict, and especially within ISKL, because we have this like relationship with our teachers. I mean, our teachers have both power and authority, both in age and both in, legitimate credentials. And I feel like I was just thinking about how when we have these discussions surrounding DEIJ, it's so hard to actually confront the teachers whenever something bad happens, or whenever you want to actually talk to them about like issues regarding DEIJ in our school, because they have that power and authority that often oversteps you and kind of just takes over what you actually want to say and devalues what you want to say. So that was something that really resonated with me. And then obviously Miss Jessica Wei Huang, addressed how should we actually approach these kinds of things, which is really insightful. So.
And that really gives that onus of control and responsibility and accountability for us adults in the community, right, Mizuki and Kai, that we have to take this accountability as a community of adults to take action, to change our mindsets that will be very supportive of a liberating experience for students. I think that's really critical. I'm going to move on to the next question for us that really will focus on sort of changes and what changes in mindsets and behaviors, sort of skill sets and competencies are required for individuals within schools to develop a culture and climate that nourishes this identity and agency and healing for adults and students. It's a little bit of a long-winded question, but really it's grounded on how can we change our behaviors and mindsets and skill sets.
I really love this one thing in the presentation that said, like believe in the impossible, like sort of trying to break down these like implicit biases or like single stories that we build within other people. And I feel like being able to do that can kind of help change our mindsets and our, reframe our thinking of, approaching different issues regarding DEIJ. So
Connect with what Kai just said. In terms of recognizing that, I think also being self-aware of things that you know and things that you don't know. Sometimes when you don't know what you don't know, it's hard to sort of correct or learn or unlearn things. So that has been something that definitely sort of came to mind as I was listening to the presentation. But yeah.
I would say to depersonalize while also empathizing with others. I think that those are some places that we could really use as jumping off points.
All right, so thank you. Some of those, and feel free to also write down your resonance and connections in the chat. I know we've got a Q&A later in a few minutes, but I would like to jump into the next question around challenges. Now, what do you anticipate are the challenges of shifting cultures at school?
I can talk a little bit about that. I think as a student leadership team member who's part of the DEIJ committee, the challenge this year was that we had to implement a whole new system into the school. This year we decided on like covering different DEIJ topics every month, and we really struggled to generate ideas because it was so new to us and to our supervisors, really. And no one knew what was the right thing to do and what wasn't. But I think the most important thing is we pushed through, and now we have a system that we can use next year. And I think it'll only get easier as years go by too.
And I worked a lot with Mizuki as well for some of our DEIJ presentations here in ISKL. And I feel like on top of that, a lot of the challenges that we really faced was that there was a lot of resistance from quite a few people. You're always going to have some people that are going to, be a little resistant against some values of DEIJ. And that was a big issue, or one of our main issues that we had to target, where it's like, how can we get this message of DEIJ across without, infuriating a bunch of other people who don't necessarily agree with us. So that's something that we're still continuing to navigate. Obviously, we don't actually know how to solve this issue. It's like, how do we deal with resistance? How do you deal with pushback regarding DEIJ issues? But
something we're going to work on, right? Yeah, for sure. I think though that the SLT group that did all of the DEIJ work did a really good job of listening and responding to the community and seeing, where are the needs? What do we need to talk about? And meeting people where they're at, and then working towards the buy-in, right? And I was just mentioning one of the projects we're going to work on next year is what are we calling it? Like the pushback handbook or something like that, where we're giving the tools to students and to teachers, frankly, right? When we're talking about authority and power in these conversations, colleague to colleague, there's some issues there. I don't have authority over my colleague to say what they should or shouldn't think or how they should approach these issues, what have you. So I think that those are some tools that we'll maybe start to develop so that we can and get that buy-in that we want.
Yeah, thanks everybody. That was really great. I know I agree, Jessica. It's the same. The pushback handbook is going to be very helpful for everybody. What advice would you give leaders in our community? Now, Jessica and I were chatting about the whole idea of that leadership is something where we can decentralize it. The idea that we're all leaders. We're teachers and educators are leaders in the classroom. We have leaders in schools. We have leaders in our families. Now, what advice would you give leaders at school, in the classroom, leaders in our families, our parents, in nurturing a human-centered approach in our relationships?
I would say listen and believe. That's what I would say.
I would say stay compassionate. I really like compassionate leaders. Be a leader who you'd look up to. I think for most people, there's always like role models that they look up to. And I would try to mimic their characteristics that I like about them. And then I'd kind of just impersonate them at first. But then I'll get used to acting that way, and it sort of becomes the new me.
I feel like a piece of advice that I would give for leaders is to persist and have resilience to keep going, because a big struggle about being a leader is, again, I mentioned before, you're going to get negative pushback from other people on the message that you're trying to push out. You're going to have mass, as Ms. Jessica said, that gets put on you. As a leader, I sometimes get seen as bossy or controlling, or maybe a bit uptight because I'm very passionate about these DEIJ values. But yeah, I would just say have resilience to keep going. As a leader, it's quite hard because you have a spotlight on you and everyone's watching your every move, and you're going to make mistakes. But I think, part of the process is making those mistakes and then learning from them and being able to keep going and admitting those mistakes as well. But yeah.
And it's also worth mentioning, Kaya and Mizuki, that the work that you're doing in the high school is that we're also, as adults, we're also learning how you're navigating these complexities in leading our student body, and you're educating us as well along the way. And that the power of reciprocity in learning that decentralizes and flattens power within our communities make that community that's grounded in DEIJ a liberatory experience, because it's not grounded in power. It's a shared experience. And so we thank you for that, for your voice and work and intentional action in our community. Kath, would you want to say something?
I was just thinking about just in terms of sort of being able to share the vulnerability of the leaders. Like, the leaders don't have to have answers to every problem, every situation. And I think when they are willing to be human, I'm not saying that none of the advent is not, but just being able for us to work with someone who is human, who is able to name their vulnerability and say, hey, I'm learning this myself, this is reflective, and just having that relationship, I think, will be really great. And I second what Lisa had said about listening and affirming and being supportive of each other. I think that's quite valuable for a leader.
I think that piece about the perfection is so important, because we all think if you are a leader, you have to know it all. And so it's about, again, knowing where you're at and being open to learn as part of the process. And I think that the framework here today really gives some tangible, concrete ways to do that exactly. And I did notice someone in the chat was talking about, there's some similar protocols to critical friends and similar protocols to our adaptive schools and norms of collaboration. So we do have a lot of really good frameworks that we can use to really depersonalize and just, grow, learn. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And I think for me, what resonates with me is the whole idea of, we talked about this before when we did some briefing earlier. It's the whole idea of fear of making mistakes. And I think it limits us, it debilitates us from going forward and moving forward with our experience. And I think it's important for us to be able to know that it is something we can navigate and something we can continue to embrace the complexity of change. At this point, I'd like to offer this last 10 minutes of our time to our participants today who are here with us to ask questions or to share whatever comments that resonates with you based on our conversation today.
Hi there, I'm Dana, and I'm at the American Embassy School in New Delhi. And this year we've had a group of adults being part of our sort of first initial steps into doing some DEIJ work. And I'm really excited about looking at what ISKL has done in bringing in student voices. And so I'm a little curious as to what grade levels do the students come from, and if other community members are involved. And so if that's an appropriate question right here now, I'd love to know a little bit more about that.
Kai and I are part of the DEIJ committee and student leadership team. And the people on that committee range from 9th grade to 12th grade, and 12th graders are sort of the committee leaders that just guide. And we've been covering different DEIJ topics every month. We do advisory lessons. Kai can add on, I'm sure. But yeah, during advisory lessons, we sometimes present videos, sometimes just presentations on how to appreciate, for instance, Women's History Month. For Women's History Month, we how to appreciate women, how to spread awareness and sort of things like that.
Yeah, so just to add onto some of the stuff that we actually do, we were actually quite limited in what we could do. So as Mizuki said, we approached it with advisory lessons just to educate people. So some of the topics that we've talked about is mental health among students. And we also talk Black History Month. And we're also going to actually talk about sexual harassment, consent in the next month. As of right now, advisory lessons is kind of the only way we can approach this kind of conversation. But within our committee, we're always discussing, well, how can we actually get this message across? And we're looking at how we can possibly foster discussions within the classroom, dedicate classes to actually talk about these DEIJ issues.
I can say, though, as a high school teacher, they have just incited conversation in all kinds of places. So even though, Kai, you talk about having limited time, that conversation about can we use the N-word has I've heard that conversation echoing everywhere, and some real learning has happened with regards to gender and sexuality and mental health. So it's really interesting. Every grade watches the same presentation and participates in their advisory group, but it certainly is not just staying within the advisory group, that it's echoing everywhere. It's pretty cool. And the kids are really doing all of this work, you are all leading the charge. So it's really fantastic.
Jessica, thank you first. With the warm demander framework, is that something that you have used school-wide?
I think in past schools that I've worked in, and currently what we're doing is I've used the framework to do teacher training. And currently I'm working with our student DEIJ committee. We're actually I'm going to co-facilitate a warm demander workshop with students for teacher leaders, because students can explain very well what it means, the difference between having power over and having authority with. And I love co-facilitating with students because I think they can, sometimes explain things in ways that I don't think of. But it is training that I found really valuable to help educators and parents talk with young people, but also when there is adult to adult conflict as well. And so in terms of school-wide, I think it's a framework that's helpful for students and teachers to understand, because then when you are doing coaching or somebody needs help with this type of conversation, you can do individual coaching, right? So the framework seems very simple, but then depending on the incident, there might be certain ways to think about how to approach that specific situation.
All right. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I know that this particular session will be recorded. It has been recording, but then you can review it and ask some questions. And I think feel free to reach out to Jessica for other. It could be consultancy or a connection or facilitation of your schools. I think that is really critical in the work that we have. Before we close, a really huge thank you to our advancement team, Francis, Crystal, Kendra, who's here joining us today, for making this event happen, and of course Jessica, Lisa, Kath, Mizuki, and Kai, for the gift of learning, and to all our participants who are here today for all your connecting and questions. Thank you so much for being with us. This is our last series of the year, so we look forward to welcoming you again to our future conversation here at ISKL. Thank you very much. Terima kasih and jumpa lagi. We'll see you soon. You take care, everybody.